du regner med? Så trekker vi dette. Det en her. Ja, viktig å være det, sier de. Men ja, det det samme. Hvordan vi?
Tar med å finne. Tenk at du må se den her igjen.
Det bra, så
Ferdig med den.
Ja, jeg har begynt ny nå.
Det tar meg fra vinterveggen, så sier jeg... Hvertfall det tomt, se. Nei, men da går jeg legger det seg. Opp og ned, eller ikke heks?
Opp og ned, men du kunne gått til døra her da, så jeg kan det greit.
Ja.
Sånne nigerianske priser hos en bibliotek. Hvorfor gir det kakkoene som så spiller av det? For trenger det.
Hvis jeg skal levere noen
Nei, de sa at det eneste som er forskjellen som smaker, for det blir regnstyrt, de smaker på det der, av mindre faktisk.
Ja, det er jo sikkert det er jo litt
Do you have everything you need? I'm such a hobo. I didn't have any kind of presents like stuff. And so,
Yeah, but that makes it very easy.
well, in a way, it does. I also have been adapting as I've been talking. It's changed a little bit.
Yeah, but that's good.
I have that. Give people
That's 1 minute to pause, so
Should I just start talking?
I guess let's see when people stop coming in the door.
Okay.
That's what I did. It took like 2 minutes.
I got it like a week or so, and I don't remember what it was like.
Yeah, but you see people are arriving, right?
Yeah.
So we'll let them.
Lars Marius, hvor leverer stemmeseddelen i dag?
Ja, det går fint. Du har god tid. Nei, det var ikke.
All right, I guess I'll start. We have some people kind of filtering in, and we'll leave the door open for those folks. To introduce myself, I don't assume anybody ever knows who I am anywhere I go. And in my hometown of Portland, Oregon, I walk completely unmolested into pubs and nobody has any idea who I am. So when I travel across the world, I assume you don't know who I am either. But my name is Jeff Alworth, and I have been writing about beer for maybe 25 years, I think. And I went full-time freelance about a decade ago, a little bit more than that. And my first big project was a book called The Beer Bible, which is the one thing that people might have read if you've read anything. And in order to write that book, it was called The Beer Bible. So it was supposed to be everything about beer, which is a huge challenge, and it's an even more huge challenge for a beginning writer who's never written a book before. And I wasn't really sure how to approach it, so I just started traveling. And I came to Europe and spent a month here. The book was so long that I wrote it in 2 chunks. So I spent about a month here and then came back a second time and spent another month here. And what I realized was that beer is really a super cultural perspective. So if you heard Lars Marius's speech earlier, you got a really wonderfully scientific and technical approach, which is something I'm really bad at. But in my background, before I became a beer writer, I studied culture studies, and I thought I would be a Buddhist scholar. And so I tend to see things through this cultural lens. And what I noticed when I was traveling around the world was I would go from one country to the next, and there would be a bunch of beers that the country would make. And they would all bear a resemblance to each other, even if they were made in a different style. So you might have a weak pale beer and a strong dark beer. You might have a lager, you might have an ale in the same country. And those beers will resemble each other more closely within that country than if you go to the next country. So for example, a Belgian pale ale looks a lot more like a Belgian triple than it does an American pale ale. And that was really curious to me. I was thinking, why, what's going on here? And then I started talking to the brewers, and brewers think in a particular way, and they make beer in a particular way. And in countries, and I think it used to be that it was more regional and less national, but it has become in the modern era much more national, that German brewers think like German brewers, and Belgian brewers think like Belgian brewers, and American brewers think like American brewers. And this sort of frames the way I think about beer. I tend to think of it as this really strongly cultural product. So when I was asked to talk about what the rest of the world thinks of the Norwegian approach to brewing, I naturally thought, okay, well, let's look at the culture, because I don't understand science as well as some people do. But I do understand culture, and I see how people think about things and how they think about things that are similar. So when we see cultures, so beer travels around, right? So in America, I'm going to give you, I was asked to talk about what the rest of the world thinks of Norwegian beer, and I can't actually talk about the rest of the world, but I can talk about America, which has a pretty big influence on the rest of the world right now in brewing, so it's kind of helpful. But when beers travel around, they travel around in weird ways, and it takes a while for them to kind of transition in a way that's recognizable to the country of origin. And so right now we're at this stage where in the United States, and I think the rest of the world, if you talk about Norwegian farmhouse beer, you're really just saying Kveik Yeast, right? People don't have a big sense beyond that of what's going on. So that's the good and the bad news. I think the good news is that people have heard of Norwegian beer, and the bad news is that they have only heard of the yeast, really, and that they're immediately.
I'm really sorry, I just need to pick up.
What's that? Oh, that's fine. And the bad news is that they don't really know anything about the culture or the way that Kveik yeast is used, and so they are immediately turning it to lagers and IPAs and the things that they already know. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how the process of translation happens, and why I think that the Norwegian tradition has something to teach the rest of the world. While it may not actually have taught it too much yet, I think for one thing to keep in mind is that it's been less than a decade since Lars Marius started writing about this, and anybody who speaks English and was reading about beer ever heard of it. So the fact that we now know something about this tradition is actually pretty remarkable. Just to kind of give a background, I was, just reading the internet like everybody else, and there's this obscure guy in Norway, and he wasn't even writing about the Norwegian tradition yet. He was writing about the Lithuanian tradition, and he had this blog that was kind of simple, and he was writing these extraordinary stories, and I couldn't believe that somehow the whole world had gone around talking about beer, and we knew about pilsners, and we knew about Trappist ales, and we talked about European farmhouse ales from the perspective of saisons, even though there's not a single farmhouse brewery left in Belgium making commercial beer. So how did we miss this whole thing? And it was really extraordinary. I think a lot of the people who are really deeply into beer were kind of fascinated by these stories, and then it transitioned away from Lithuania, and he started looking more into the Norwegian tradition, and that's when the whole yeast thing came up. And I think that was a good thing and a bad thing. It was a good thing because it was something tangible. Because it's a farmhouse tradition, unless you come here, it's very difficult to understand what the beers, how they're made, or what they're going to taste like. You can't buy a bottle. You can't go down to the bottle shop. You can get a Gez, but you can't buy a beer from Voss or something. So when the Kveik Yeast started to become available, people began to think, oh, we know Norwegian beer, we can buy Kveik Yeast. And I feel like it was a real missed opportunity in one way, or maybe just kind of a shadow of what was to come. And it's also completely typical for the way things happen. To go back to my thinking about things in culture and thinking about how beer moves around, this is kind of the important, if I say anything that's valuable, I think it's the way to think about national tradition or regional tradition. It has 4 elements, and these elements are easier or harder to understand depending on which one you're talking about. So it starts out with ingredients. We all local beer is made with local ingredients, right? So when you think about Czech Pilsner, you're thinking about local Moravian malts or a Moravian barley malted locally. You're thinking about Saaz hops. That's sort of the basis. And if you go around the world and you look at brewing traditions, they may actually now have more international ingredients, but historically and traditionally, it always started from ingredients. That was the base that led to everything else. What you had to make the beer out of, and we can talk about things like chicha, which is the corn beer of South America, really important defining ingredient. You can't make Pilsner out of corn, right? So the ingredients you have will dictate things that come later. The second piece is the brewing process. So the way you work with those ingredients, and that is also dictated by those ingredients. So one of those is water, and I think we've heard a lot about the way water chemistry affects the conversion and the flavor profile of malts. The malts themselves, whether they were originally roasted or wind malts or whatever you have. The classic flavor profiles of so many of the beers we know in the world today have an association with the local hops now. So, if you're thinking about a British beer, you've got Fuggles and East Kent Goldings. If you're thinking about an American IPA, you're thinking about Citron Mosaic, on and on. So the ingredients are incredibly important in dictating what you do with those ingredients when you're making the beer. So these different brewing processes happen. So in the United States, for example, when we had these incredibly strong American hops that were hard to work with, we started to recognize that you have to use them later in the process. You have to use them in the whirlpool. You have to use them as dry hopping in order to make them palatable so they're not super bitter. If you look at any beer style, you're going to find a similar kind of course where the ingredients dictate how brewers work with those things. The third thing is the culture that the beer exists in. And this is a subtle one, but it's incredibly important. So by culture, I mean, how do people drink beer? Do they drink it in little bottles, very strong beer in little bottles at the dinner table where they decant it? Do they drink it in big steins by the liter? Do they drink it? Is it a strong beer like an American IPA? Is it a weak beer meant to be drunk in volume? Do you drink it in pubs? Do you drink it in guest houses? Where do you drink it? All of that stuff is a big part of the culture. But also things like the laws. How is it taxed? Because how it's taxed is going to probably dictate whether you have strong beer or weak beer, right? If it's taxed at a high level, like in Britain, weak beer is going to become very common. You just drink a lot more of it because it's cheaper. War and famine have really shaped the way beers have evolved. So the Great Gravity Drop following World War I, which happened even more prominently following World War II. Beers before in the United Kingdom, before First World War, they were pretty similar to American strengths. You know, you would have a 6% beer pretty commonly. That's considered a very strong beer in Britain today. So all those things kind of contribute into the culture of the beer itself. And then finally you have styles. So how the brewers have the ingredients, they have the culture, and they have the brewing processes, and then they're going to work within those contexts to make, you know, in Germany, they're going to make Helles, they're going to make Dunkel. There's another process that's coming, you know, another whole vein of brewing that produces Weizenbier. But the Weizenbier looks actually kind of similar, except for the yeast. When you look at the mash and you look at the way the beer is made and what it's made out of, looks pretty similar to Helles, right? Like when you go to a German brewing school, they teach you how to make a Pilsner, because if you can make a Pilsner, then you can make a Weizenbier. You can make a Schwarzbier. You can make anything. When beers travel, they travel, any one of those things can be one of the things that another country picks up on. So typically, that's going to be in the ingredient or the style. Actually, let me just back up, just to say it again. It's a national tradition or regional tradition is ingredients, brewing process, culture, and style. Those are the four kind of important components. So which of those travels? When other people learn about the beer, which this is super common, goes back hundreds of years, that a style will become popular beyond its region. Typically, it's going to be the style that travels. And the style is going to go into the next country or the next region and immediately hit the wall of the people who brew in an entirely different way. So when British porters got to Germany, all of a sudden German brewers started making them they didn't make them the way they made them in London. They were German brewers. They thought about them differently. One of my favorites is the Belgians are the most interesting, because they love the beers from other countries. But when they recreate them, they're super Belgian. They don't taste like those beers at all. So they went through this big kind of love affair with the British Isles, and they made Scotch ale and they made pale ales. And when they made them, they just tasted exactly like Belgian ales, because they weren't using the same ingredients, they weren't using the same techniques that the British were. So on the other end, they go through this cultural filter and they look totally different. So it takes a long time for a beer to reappear in another country, if it ever does, in a way that even remotely resembles the country of origin. I should stop here. Can everybody hear me? And am I speaking too fast? Because I tend to do that. Perfect. Okay. Okay. that's the background. We're going to get back to Norwegian beer, I promise. Are there any questions on that point? Okay. So now we come back. That's sort of the context, right? So now we come back to a little less than a decade ago. The rest of the world finds out about Norwegian beer. So what happens? They take the thing that they can understand, which in this case is not the raw ale. It's not these amazing kettles that you have over these fire pits. It's the Kveik Yeast, because that's something that can travel and something that somebody can understand. Oh, and the other thing, I think in the Norwegian case, it was slightly different than the usual kind of transmission, because nobody could try these beers because they're non-commercial beers, so you can't buy a bottle of it. I'm looking around at many brewers in the room, and I think, you know, I can't buy a bottle of Schetel's beer and say, this is what the style tastes like. So you don't even have that to go by. You have the descriptions of a few people who have heard about them. So what can possibly go out into the world? And in this case, kind of remarkably, and given the short amount of time that we've had, it's the Kveik Yeast. But it doesn't go out so that the beers that are made with this yeast strain elsewhere taste like they do in Norway. They taste radically different because nobody's ever tasted these beers, first of all. And secondly, the yeast labs aren't doing, it's not like the yeast labs are taking those little dried cakes that are so valuable and, you know, culturing all of those strains in there and selling that. I think there might be one lab, but for the most part, that's not what commercial breweries want. They don't want a whole bunch of yeast strains that might function very differently in a commercial context. The entire commercial beer industry is built around having a predictable kind of process so that you can replicate it. So they pull out interesting strains in each one of these Kveik strains, and they call it Voss strain, or they call it Hornindal strain, or whatever they call it, the Sigmund strain, even though it's not really like that. And even though nobody who brews with it has ever had a beer made with those yeasts in situ. And then the brewers get this and they think, I'll brew something with it and see what it does, and then see how I can shape the flavor profile it produces to make the kind of beer I'm already making. And maybe it'll do something interesting. So in the United States, Kveik Yeast, maybe kind of bad. COVID has really thrown off my sense of time. I used to be able to say 3 years ago this happened, and then COVID came, and now I don't remember. There's a big black hole. But I think maybe 5 years ago, we started seeing beers made with Kveik Yeast. And at first, the thing that people knew about them was that they produced these amazing esters if you fermented warm enough. And almost uniformly, Americans would not ferment them at temperatures that were warm enough. So they would ferment them at, okay, let's see if I can do the math here. Like, 23 degrees, something like that. Am I getting that right? Is that like a typical, like they would, use the Chico strain or something. Maybe they would do it a little bit warmer. Maybe they'd be like, I brewed in a Belgian ale. I know that I can go up a little bit, so I'm going to go up a little bit. But is Ivar in the room? Oh, there you are. He was telling me today that he was brewing, he ferments his beer at over 40. There is no American brewer that I've ever heard of who would ever consider pitching a beer that warm. Inconceivable. They wouldn't even do it. So now you have American brewers who are using single strain versions of these yeasts. They're making beer in a way that's kind of inappropriate, and they're making styles that are completely separated from the styles that are made here. And they're getting interesting stuff, right? And they're starting to share information because that's what brewers do. So they're finding out that, if I ferment at this temperature, I'll get this ester profile with this yeast strain. But if I go a little bit higher, I'll get this ester profile. If I underpitch, I get this. If I overpitch, all these things. And it's actually producing really interesting beer. And brewers love it because it ferments fast and clean. So all of that is great. The other thing that brewers have discovered, and I think this is actually quite interesting in terms of if you think about commercial brewing, the brewers have started to use them kind of on the down low to make lagers, and they don't call, some breweries will call out that they're Nordic lagers is sometimes what Americans will call them, or pseudo lagers, and they'll mention that they're made with Kveik yeast. But a lot of times they won't, because it's honestly, it's confusing to the customers who don't really know what a lager is in the first place. So to say it's a Kveik lager is really confuses things. But they're making, I've seen a lot of people trying to take shortcuts on lagers and making beers that are recognizably not lagers. You know, they're fermenting them really short. You're not cleaning them up properly, or you're using ale yeasts that are like a Kolsch strain, and you're getting you're just getting too much fruitiness. It's not doesn't taste like let's say you're making a Pilsner with a Kolsch strain. You can't make a Pilsner taste like as crisp and nice as you'd like. But the strain that, don't ask me which strain it is, but the strain that the brewers in America have figured out that works really well to make a lager, the Kveik strain, does a really credible job. It's actually really hard to tell. And if you're in a production brewery, time is money, space is money. So if you can blast a lager through your brew house in 2 weeks instead of 2 months, you're saving an incredible amount of money, especially if the customer can't tell the difference. If there's no trade-off, it's a huge deal. So Americans now are starting to plug these Kveik strains into their beers to make American styles, but the word Kveik is starting to fall out of. I think they're making just as many of these beers, but the word Kveik is not even appearing on the labels as much as it used to, because people don't really know what it is. Why would they? They haven't read Lars Marius's blog. It's confusing, and the last thing you want to do is confuse customers. So that's kind of the situation that we're in. But and I think I would guess that that's true all over the world where craft breweries are using these strains. I don't think I can speak definitively that that's what's happening in the United States for sure, but I don't know. I would expect that that's what's happening in London, Copenhagen, places around that you have small craft breweries making these beers. So I guess the question then, there is one other super interesting element here. In modern commercial craft brewing, people are starting to make very kind of weird beers like pastry stouts and smoothie sours and milkshake IPAs. And this has opened the door. I'm assuming everybody knows what those are, but you don't actually have to know what those are. So I'm just going to move along. There are these highly constructed beer styles that have that may taste like ice cream or apple pie or whatever. And initially, there was a kind of impulse to use natural ingredients to be you're a craft brewer. So if you're going to make a beer that tastes like a blueberry muffin, you should use blueberries and you should use actual vanilla. But then it turns out that customers don't care. So you can buy these plastic buckets that have blueberry flavor, and you can buy artificial vanilla and make these beers a lot more cheaply. And in the realm of yeast science, we're starting to see these really interesting genetically modified yeast strains that have they used the CRISPR technology to pull out the gene that produces diacetyl. So you can make all the same yeast strains, but modify it so it will never produce diacetyl, which is this off flavor or flavor that many people don't want in their beer. you can use a genetically modified yeast to produce esters that taste like the flavors you find in hops. So you can, there are yeast labs now selling yeasts that taste like Cascade hops or taste like Citra hops. So you don't have to use as much Citra hops. Cool thing, right? And it's sort of an interesting moment in American brewing because the whole craft brewing tradition started out as a reaction against industrial brewing, where they were using adjuncts and flavorings and clarifiers and all these other things. And so the first craft brewers said, no, we're going to make beer traditional. We're not going to use any of that fancy chemical stuff. And now we've kind of come back around, and it's the people who are the leaders of the chemical kind of revolution are now craft brewers. They're, you'll find a lot of plastic buckets in breweries that make these kinds of beers. So Kveik yeast is actually super cool because it's an organic alternative to this trend. So you have many breweries who don't actually want to make beer like that. They still have a sense that you should make beer traditionally. And Kveik yeast does all these cool things that are not genetically modified, right? Like I can get all those same esters. I don't have to have a GMO yeast strain. I can get, I just get to find the right Kveik strain, and I'll get those same esters if I brew this way. I don't need to have a genetically modified lager strain that's going to be able to go super fast. I can use this Kveik strain. So in that way, I think it's actually quite interesting and pretty beneficial for breweries to have this organic alternative to the kind of trend that we're seeing in craft brewing. Okay, so now we come back to where do we go from here? How could we communicate something more significant about the Norwegian tradition that's not just this square peg that you can plug in at the brewery? And I think this is probably partly where people like me have a big role to play in trying to communicate something more interesting about the culture that we have, that I've seen in Norway, which honestly, I've been writing about beer for a long time, and I've traveled all over the world, and I have honestly never seen anything like this. I mean, I've seen a bunch of cool stuff. Been to Bamberg, where they make Kraut beer, and seen them smoking their own malt. Told half of you guys do that here too. I've been to the great old Victorian breweries in Britain, where they still do cask ale, which is a super labor-intensive thing all the way from the brewing process through the cellar. But I've honestly never seen anything like what's going on here, and because the tradition, that the farmhouse tradition that we're celebrating at this festival is a non-commercial one, you can afford to have people spend 12 hours or more making a beer. And that is something that can never happen in a commercial context. And it allows all these super fascinating things to happen if you have brewers who are going to spend that much time making beer. So the question is, that's the interesting part, right? Like the synthesis of Kveik yeast to make a good lager is kind of cool, but in the end of the day, it's not actually very significant, and it doesn't really change anybody's understanding of beer or engage people in what's interesting about Norwegian beer. So I'm wondering, how do we communicate the more interesting stuff beyond just those yeast strains? And I'm kind of curious I would love to have you guys offer some ideas here. I've thought a little bit about this as well. But I do think that there are, the world of beer is quite large, and you're always going to have your Carlsbergs, your Heinekens, your Anheuser-Busch's making big industrial lager. But you also have people making beer at a small scale, and they're interested in various, interesting kinds of beer processes. So in the United States right now, we're going through this thing where everybody's discovering Franconian lager, which is really surprising to me. It's not just lager. Americans are getting interested in craft lager too, but they're really getting interested in Franconian lager. So you're starting to find breweries crop up that have kits that are designed to make this kind of beer. So there's one in Chicago called Dovetail that uses decoction mashing. It has open fermentation, and they even have a cool ship, which is the vessel that you put historically you would have put the beer in to cool. This is a slightly different use than the Belgians, where they're trying to inoculate it with yeast. It'll only spend 60 minutes there. They even have one of those. So they're trying to do everything exactly the way a small Franconian brewery would make it. And many of these American breweries are now using the Central European ball valve, which produces these wonderful heads that you find in the Czech Republic. So they're attempting to use all the techniques, all the processes that Franconian breweries use, and not just trying to hit the flavor profile, or even just throwing a name on a beer that doesn't have anything to do with the flavor profile. 20 years ago in the United States, if you'd ordered a Czech Pilsner, it would have been made with American malts. It might have been made with ale yeast and just fermented cold.
Yeah.
And it would probably have been single infusion mashing. And it probably had Saaz hops, which is all Americans knew that's what a Czech lager was. It had Saaz hops. Now you have people who know all these other things. They're making Czech lagers, they're making Franconian lagers, because they're super interested in the process. And they realize that when you go through these processes, you get a different flavor profile. And if you understand them at a deep level and you really work with them, and you do have to fiddle with them, a lot of these breweries don't make uniformly excellent beer because it takes a while to master this stuff. Then you can finally begin to make really interesting beer that's similar to all of the components that created that interesting beer wherever it came from. So to go back to my four pieces, you have, I should be able to do this off the memory, but ingredients, brewing process, culture, and styles. So I think the interesting thing that we can communicate to people about the Norwegian tradition is the culture and process piece, right? Because that's the thing that you can't see from America. It's just impossible. Until I was coming from Oslo in May and coming on the train and dropping down into the deep valley of Voss, I didn't understand how this whole tradition survived. And then I'm sure you've all taken that train. It's one of the most remarkable things in the world. It's like you're dropping like a shot right next to that river that is like a waterfall, and then you're in this valley, and you think, I see. 100 years ago, it would have been almost impossible to get in this valley. Of course, it concentrates culture. Of course, people know what they know what their ancestors did. It's like totally preserved here. Until you see that for yourself, you can't understand why people would do things a certain way. So understanding the cultural piece, and I would love to write a little bit more about this. There's when I arrived in Voss, Kjetil said, "Do you want a beer?" And I said, "Oh, sure, I'll have a beer." And then you made the offering to the little people? So an American is like, what is happening? This is really unusual. And, I learned over the course of brewing there, and then I saw again, was it just yesterday that we had the brewing at where Steve did our brewing? Was that just yesterday?
Yes.
Whew. I'm a little jet laggy. We saw what raw ale was like, right? Like, that's super bizarre. From America, raw ale, not boiling the wort, is almost inconceivable. So there's these traditions and processes that create the context for this style of beer, and that's actually where all the interest lies. As a beer writer, I'm sort of the emissary. I can go to the world and say, "Ooh, this is actually an interesting thing." This other beer style, if you only know beer through the sense of style, the flavor of the beer, and you don't know the background, you may not understand which beer styles are especially cool and which are just kind of like, whatever. This is a really cool beer style. And it's cool not because the yeast is funky. That's a component, but it's cool because there's so much stuff in the culture and in the weird processes. I know they don't seem weird to you, but from my perspective, they seem very unusual. I think if we can start getting people to see more of that piece, they're going to find this tradition incredibly compelling. I think there's a few things about this that are sort of interesting to me. One thing is this, I've been writing about beer long enough that I've seen a backlash. I've seen backlashes come and go. Like there's an oscillation. So originally I mentioned craft beer was a reaction to industrial brewing, and then it was a very creative process, and this creative process has fed into this better brewing through science approach. And it's almost inevitable that the next phase is going to be a reset back to craft, back to process, tradition, ingredient, back to the thing that captured the attention and imagination of brewers in America 45 years ago. And that's the kind of thing that I think this tradition will really appeal to. Brewers are the people who, so in a commercial brewery, you have two competing interests. You have the marketing team, and you have the brewing team. And the marketing team is very concerned about what the customer thinks, and they're always out there looking at where the trends in the industry are. And the brewers are interested in all the stuff that we're talking about today. And they don't know what the customer likes. They know what they like. And they, they want to make weird beers that they think are super cool. In the United States, for a good 10 years, brewers loved saisons. And you could find saisons everywhere. Every brewery made a saison. Every brewery, would tout them and talk about how wonderful they are. You sit around with brewers and ask them what their favorite beer styles were. They would say saisons. Absolutely wouldn't sell at all. So, the marketing department would say, "Why are you guys making this stuff? You should be making whatever selling at the time, IPA or whatever it happened to be." But eventually, if you just chase trends, you're eventually going to run out of innovative steam. And when we see traditions like IPA in the United States and the new lager, the revival of lager come, those are brewer led. And they become, because brewers are so passionate about these traditions and the way the beers are made, they make them these wonderful, complex, delicate beers that are super interesting. A lot of times, some of those will carry through. And so I think brewers are the people, one of the groups of people we need to talk to. Tourists are awesome. I think we should definitely I'm going to try to direct tourists to Norway, but I think also brewers are really important. And I hope that maybe in future editions of this event, we could get some foreign brewers, I know American brewers, but probably British brewers and German brewers and other brewers to come and look at this, because I'm certain they'll fall in love with what's happening. When I was drinking beer and talking to people this afternoon, I could have talked for hours to every single brewer. I had so many questions, and that's how brewers are too. And they become the emissaries that start making these beers. They're not going to make these exact beers, but they're going to think about beer differently, and they're going to think about mixed culture yeast strains, that you guys have here. And they're, instead of thinking, how do I plug and play a Kveik strain to make an IPA, they're going to think, how do I take a Kveik strain to make something I've never made before? And what do I have to do? What do I have to learn from these brewers in order to understand how to make that beer so it's palatable and expresses the strain, the yeast, in a way that I don't know how to do? So I think it's really important that we get brewers here, and I hope we can work on that. I think many of the the farmhouse brewers I've met would be, completely. Brewers would just find you incredibly fascinating and have the same million questions that I have. I have also been fairly interested in two other components, and this is just me. Well, one of them is not me spitballing. One of them is me spitballing more. The first one that I think is interesting is in Norway, you now have commercial breweries that are trying to take the farmhouse tradition and make it, adapt it for commercial brewing. And I don't actually know how that works so much, and I don't know how appealing it's going to be to Norwegian customers. It's going to have to, it's that marketing versus brewing thing. That's clearly a brewer-led thing. Brewers like, we should definitely make these beers because they're super interesting and they're part of our heritage and our tradition. And then marketers will be like, well, what does it sell? So we have to wait and see if that comes together. But if you start having commercial breweries in Norway who are able to create a style, something you can sell in a bottle shop in Portland, Oregon, and people can drink it and taste it, that'll really help. So I'm curious to see how that all plays out. I know there are several or more breweries that are working with that tradition here. And so I think that's a really important piece. The last piece, and then I can throw it open for questions, is something that is really fascinating. And I don't know how easy it is to import, but it's the thing that engages me the most. And it's that you don't brew 5 gallons or 20 liters of beer at a time like American home brewers, which is a personal volume. American home brewers will brew a small batch and they may share it with their friends when they come over, but basically they're brewing enough beer for themselves. And the tradition here is much more community focused. So it exists in between commercial brewing and the kind of modern American home brewing. There's no equivalent to community brewing in the modern world that I'm aware of. And it's an old tradition. European brewing as a community was much more common hundreds of years ago. You see a little bit of it in the Zweigel tradition in Germany. But we've become in our modern world, we live on our phones and we don't live together. There's a famous idea about people don't go bowling. They're not members of bowling leagues anymore. And I don't know if you guys have bowling, but it was this way of bringing people together. You could talk about community groups like the Grange and the Elks Club and stuff like that we have in the United States. We don't do that anymore. So the community, the sense of community that we have, where we're together drinking beer. We did the Skaka.
Skaka.
There you are.
That's why we have to brew so much, because Skaka, one of the third of the beer can disappear.
Exactly. We don't have that, and it is awesome. And I would love to try to figure out how to communicate that, the joy of getting together, creating some kind of excuse so you can all get together and drink beer. I posted on Facebook a thing about the brewing yesterday, and my wife said, do the little people get to try this beer just like you do? And I said, that's the awesome thing. Everybody gets to try this beer. It's made for everybody. That's the whole point of it. It's not supposed to be a special beer that you keep to yourself. It's a beer that you share and you use it as an excuse to bring people together. So I don't know how that could possibly become an idea that would spread, but it's certainly an idea that does not exist outside of Norway much, and not in the United States at all. And it's awesome. And so I'm trying to figure out, like, how do I get my group of homebrewers in Oregon? Like, how do we get a big pot? Do we get a fire pit, or like, what are we gonna? I haven't quite put all the pieces together, but I feel like making batches of beer that are much larger than 5 gallons, and using it as an excuse to invite a bunch of people over and celebrate brewing is something that that the rest of the world can use. It's good for the heart, and we probably need more connections right now. So I think that's just to sum up, the rest of the world doesn't know about this tradition as much as they should. And it's a complex tradition that's really hard to communicate because it doesn't have the easy hook of having a style that you can just point to. And the ingredients are pretty specific to Norway, so that doesn't travel as well either. It's much more a processed beer, it's much more a culture beer. But I think the flip side to that is that's what makes it so valuable for the rest of the world. And people like me need to try to figure out how to communicate that and probably direct folks here so they can experience it. And I hope you're ready to welcome a bunch of Americans if I can do my job. So I think that's about all I have to say. So what's that?
Now we're gonna make a big, if we all go together, we can make a big pot of beer to all the Americans.
There you are. I'll try to do my part. So I think that's probably all I have to say on this. And if you have questions or comments or ideas, I'm both ears open. Sorry, the door was squeaking and I kind of missed the story. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because there's this commercial piece, right? And when you start plugging it into a financial model, it's hard to pull off. You guys make beer that, you're not selling the beer. And so it's hard to figure out how to, big brewery, commercial breweries have large vessels, so they produce a lot of beer, but they also have a business model that doesn't depend on hosting big festivals. So I'm not sure how that works. Yeah.
I have a question about single strain and multi-strain Kveik.
Yeah.
Because it seems like the commercialization of Kveik is mostly single strain, but what we can experience here is multi-strain Kveik, where the result is often different in each batch. You can have the same wort and you can ferment it into vessels, and it's different. So that doesn't translate very well to commercial brewing, where you want consistency. So what do you think about that?
I think it's a mental model thing. And I think the current mental model is that when you pitch a yeast strain, you want it to do a precise thing. And it doesn't have to be that way, right? So there are a bunch of beer styles that don't, the yeast doesn't do what you want it to do. The United States has actually done a lot of really nice work, I think, in working with wild yeast and bacteria. And brewers know they are going to get what they're going to get. And, they can work with it a little bit by blending, so that can help bring some consistency to it. But if you don't expect the yeast to behave in a consistent, manner, if you're looking for a little expressivity, and you can communicate that to the customers, so the customers begin to want expressivity, and that becomes part of the fun, is to see how this batch of beer turns out. There are breweries that do that, or there are traditions that do that. The cask ale tradition is like that. You don't expect a cask bitter to be exactly the same every time you walk into a pub, and nobody complains when it's not. So this is one of those. It's not an insurmountable hurdle, but brewers need to talk to foreign brewers need to talk to farmhouse brewers and understand how to shift that mental model, so that they can. Because from a brewer's perspective, the idea that you're going to get all this so much more complexity out of a beer, that's very attractive. So the big barrier then becomes customer expectation. So I don't think it's insurmountable, and I think in some ways I don't totally know the ecosystem of brewer and yeast lab, but I do think that the yeast labs kind of cut off the possibilities by not even offering these multi-strain batches because I think there's a bunch of breweries that would give them a shot and see what happens and have fun with them. So maybe we just need to talk to the yeast labs about, doing more of that stuff. And actually, I love Kveik Yeast, so maybe there's 2 yeast labs within 50 miles of my hometown, including one that's about 2 miles away. So maybe we can convince them to look at those things and see what they look like and how they could possibly be made to work. Not that I'm going to give them that strain. Just saying. So that's what I would say.
But I think all of these people around there brewing in different styles. Not different styles, they're doing their own brew, but every brew is tasting different. And you have some of the commercial breweries in Norway who are now taking this tradition to the next step and will replicate this style. And I think there we have this job. We have to communicate with those, talk to the breweries, and get a authenticity of that into to their styles, because that's the only way for people from abroad to buy the beer, actually.
Yeah.
So I think to communicate this style, we have to talk to the commercial brewers. We have to have a dialogue. I think that's important. As well. And to get people into our houses and just invite them into elders.
Right. Yeah.
Do you have any reflection on the Norwegian commercial brewers and their application of traditional Norwegian, whether it be Kveik or traditional malting?
Yeah.
Because you were talking about how it could be, how it's appropriated abroad, or how you just take the ingredient and you sort of fit it into your own culture. Maybe tie that into what we heard here about the connection between the traditional brewer and the commercial brewer. That was sort of something very interesting that came out of this talk, I think.
Yeah, and I think so. I'm going to mispronounce this probably, but Ike and Tid in Oslo, is that the name of the brewery? Am I pronouncing that close to actual? They do interesting stuff. Amund was at the other 2 sessions, and he's not here, of course, so I can't rely on him to help explain what's going on. But they've taken a lot of that same tradition and produced beers that are sour, so not typical of the farmhouse styles. But they're using Kveik yeast and I think the multi-strain, but they're working with the bacteria that's resident in it somehow to create a whole range of beer styles that don't look like farmhouse and don't look like commercial, but they take all of that wisdom and put it into the beers they're making, and they really honor that tradition. So I think that's one really interesting example of a direction that this could go. That would, begin to make it a little bit more understandable to other people. So we talked to Amund about how well that's working, but certainly his beers are quite interesting and really tasty. So I think there's so many. It's been a decade, less than a decade, that people have been working with this. And brewers are incredibly creative and ingenious people, and when they start working on projects like this, they come up with fascinating stuff. So I'm curious to see what they would come up with. It's hard to predict, but that's one example already.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I can see they're also only producing raw ale.
Yeah.
They never boil their ale. I'm thinking that this could be a thing that's kind of right, because of course, you shorten the brewing time quite a lot.
Right.
You get a flavor that you cannot get from anywhere else, this raw ale flavor. And it's also in this, now we're talking about energy prices everywhere, we're cutting energy production a lot.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking raw ale is super interesting and could catch on, hopefully.
I think you're right, and it's something that nobody knows about, and outside of the farmhouse tradition, it seems bizarre. Like, The mental model is not there. People would not, they would just, if you ask a commercial brewer who had never heard about rye ale, can you make beer like this? Would it work? They would say, absolutely. It's going to be infected. It's going to be terrible. You can't make beer like that. Brewers have very strong opinions, and they have very strong opinions about the way other people make beer. That's usually wrong. They know how that you ask them how they make beer. Don't ask them how other people make beer. But yeah, I think you're right. One of the things you realize when you come to Norway is that all of these regions where you have where you make these beers like this are surrounded by forests, right? So you can see, oh, one of the reasons you can afford to do an 8-hour boil is because you have 1 million trees, whereas in Arizona, not going to translate so well. So I think you're right. I think rye ale is super interesting, and it could be. It's one of those packets of information, a single idea that could be communicated pretty easily. So it's interesting. That's a good idea. Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on that because this festival has given rise to an interesting example of someone using raw ale technique in a way you wouldn't expect. The brewery? No.
I don't.
They're the most famous Norwegian craft brewery, and
oh yes, sorry. I have to try to map what you're saying to the words that I've seen. Yes, yeah. I know.
They've been here every year, and their head brewer has been super interested in learning from that brewers. And they made a pale ale that was below the alcohol limits that could be sold in shops. So 4.5%, and it's not that easy to do that well. So what they did was they made it as a raw ale, so that the protein would fill out the body and it would still be a nice beer. I thought that was just a very interesting example of somebody taking the concept and then using it in a completely new way, in a very conscious and premeditated way.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of room for doing this sort of thing in brewing, and one thing that struck me was if you ask a modern brewer, why do you boil the wort? They don't have an answer.
Because everybody's always boiled wort.
So it's not to get to the point where you make a conscious decision.
And there's another element there that I think is so important. In my region, we have fresh hop ales, where you go and you take the hops that are unkilned, they're not dried, and you put them in the beer. And they produce flavors that you can't really appreciate until you've had a bunch of them. If you drink a bunch of them, then all of a sudden you can recognize what a fresh hop tastes like. But if you just give a can to somebody who's never tasted it, they almost certainly won't recognize what the flavor is. Rye ales are the same way. They have an interesting flavor that you can't appreciate until you've had them a few times. And I've only started now on my second trip here to begin to understand there's this, I don't know, we don't have, in the English language, we don't have words to describe what raw ale is supposed to taste like, but it has a kind of a sprouted flavor almost. There's almost a green quality, and somebody was pointing out there's many more proteins in it, so you get a more dense mouthfeel. In order for people to appreciate that, they have to be exposed to it much more. So you actually, and I think this is where brewers are so important, because brewers will appreciate that. They'll see it and they'll think, ooh, this is something that I like and it's different and I can work with it. So yeah, I think there's a lot of possibilities here like that. All right, we've gone over and I don't have anything more to say. Any other last questions? I want to say, I have one more thing to say, which is, as a writer who's traveled all over the world and who thought he knew everything about beer, it has been an incredible revelation and one of the great joys of my writing life to be exposed to what's going on in Norway. It's just remarkable. It's not like anything else in the world, and the fact that it's non-commercial and you kind of have to seek it out and spend time with people at their homes to try it. It's just really, it's a special thing. And you probably know that, but sometimes people who grow up with the thing don't know how rare and special it is. So I can reflect back that for somebody who thought he knew a lot about beer, it was really remarkable to see it, and I felt really privileged. And I want to thank Lars Marius for inviting me, it's been a real pleasure to be exposed to this. So I will try to be that evangelist to get people to come and see it too. So thank you.